You are listening to Accents, a radio show for literature, art, and culture. I'm your host, Katerina Stoikova, and my guest today is writer and poet Stephen Wingate. Hi, Stephen, how are you?
Hi, Katerina. It's great to be with you again on the
Yes,
airwaves.
yes. Um, I enjoy talking to you again, and I look forward to catching up. Uh, our listeners may or may not remember that we had a conversation with you about your first poetry book, I think. And
Mhm.
since then, a lot has happened. Stephen Wingate's books include the novels The Leave Takers, which is about to come out now in 2021, of Fathers and Fire, 2019, both published by the University of Nebraska Press as part of its Flyover Fiction Series. And he also has an award-winning short story collection and prose poem collection, 31 octets, incantations and meditations, and we might convince him to read a couple for us. So you've been busy, you've been productive, you've been successful.
Well, it's certainly busy and productive. I think every writer always wants to see more audience and interconnect with their audience more. I'm a bit of a shy person and a homebody, which is one of the reasons maybe I get a lot of writing done. But I'd love to balance it out more with you know seeing more people, even connecting with them virtually. I mean, this is all we can really do right now. But some balance would be great, but I can't complain about the time that I've been able to have to write. It's been really wonderful.
And you have a new book coming out. I'm very excited about that. The Leave
I
Takers. Tell us about it.
Yes, and the actual physical books, I
Oh,
just got them in the mail, so you
lovely.
are the first person to see them, other than my wife. Um, yeah, I'm very excited. This novel's taken so long to write, and it's very personal, and it was, I think all good books that I've enjoyed in my life have in some way been a labor of love. So that's the kind of books that I want to write, books that are really labors of love. When I try to write any other kind of book that my heart just isn't in, I don't have the stamina to go through many drafts, and I don't have the heart to throw away things that aren't working and try new ones. So I have to have that incredible investment in the work in order to really do it.
So, what is the book about?
The book's about a couple of 30-ish artists named Jacob and Lainey, and he's originally from Boston. She's originally from Los Angeles, and they find themselves in South Dakota, where Jacob had spent a few years as a teenager. They'd both been together in Los Angeles and come within a miscarriage of getting married. And they meet up by chance again 4 years later and say, well, who better understands me than this person? Because they have a lot of family grief. They've lost a lot of dead loved ones who they're always saying goodbye to, sort of perpetually, which is how the title comes about, the leave takers, always taking leave of the dead. And they also have a low level but persistent prescription pharmaceutical problem that they're struggling with. So they find themselves in kind of the middle of nowhere, South Dakota, just sort of fighting their demons and trying to become real people.
How welcome do they feel in South Dakota? The man from Boston and the woman from LA?
Not particularly, especially the man from Boston, because when he arrived, he was immediately pegged as an outsider. He was never really fully accepted as a teenager, and he came here after his parents' death to stay with an uncle, and he he was never accepted, and then he became an artist, which a rural town of less than 1,000 people was not a popular decision. It's funny. Lainey, who comes from L.A., is actually she came to South Dakota without having preconceived notions. So she's actually settling in a little bit better, but she doesn't really understand the place and how it works. So in a way, both of them are me. I think when we write novels, we are our characters. We can't help it. It's just part of the DNA of your characters. It's as if you take a little bit of yourself and put it into a petri dish, and that grows off into a new direction from the normal you. It becomes this other version of yourself. So one of the things that I've been doing, I think, through this novel is reconciling myself to living in South Dakota, where I've now lived for a decade and teaching at South Dakota State University. I have a lot to work out about my relationship with the place. And part of that has been through this novel, which originally, when I first wrote it, was set in Colorado. And then when I became set in South Dakota, I saw it as an opportunity to reconcile myself to being in South Dakota and kind of deal with these feelings. And I actually am way happier with the novel as it stands in South Dakota because I've been able to really isolate my characters a lot more. Before they were in Colorado, they could just go hang out with their friends. There were tons of people nearby, big gallery scene. South Dakota, it's kind of them and their demons. And stripping all of that out made for a much more raw novel for me. And I really enjoyed the opportunity to really get in there and not have any distractions, just deal with them and their demons.
Demons or ghosts, or is there a difference?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Some ghosts are just ghosts, and some ghosts are demons, and some ghosts go in and out. In this novel, the almost everybody in their family is dead. You meet these people every once in a while, and yeah, this so and so's dead, so and so's dead, and both of them really kind of just have each other. Very recently, Lainey's father had died, and a year ago, Jacob's brother had died. So the last people in their families are now gone. And the ghosts, they really change personalities from time to time. Sometimes the ghosts can be very supportive. Sometimes they're very admonishing. Sometimes they accentuate their fears. Sometimes they assuage your fears. And for me, that's been kind of my experience of ghosts as well. My dad died when I was 10, so I have most of my life with that ghost. And about almost 5 years ago, my brother died. And so I live with that ghost too.
Yeah.
And to me, it's endlessly fascinating because they have so many different personalities. They're not static, and they're like a regular human relationship. It's just with a dead person. And how much of that we fill in, I think we fill in most of it, but it's still an interesting dynamic for me, and one that I love studying and
Well,
working on in this book.
relationship with dead people also changes. You're right, because we change, and this we change, it takes for one person to change in a relationship for the whole relationship to change.
Hmm. Yeah. And sometimes we start to learn something and we realize, oh, wow, this person who's dead, they already knew that and I didn't. And I also think that we tend to assume that the dead know a lot because they have a perspective on life. Their life is over. So they're able to look back, and it changes how we have them running as programs in our own minds.
How did you come up with names for your characters?
Ah, I don't really know. Although I do know with Jacob. Jacob's last name is Nassadrine,
Mhm.
and that is an actual misreading of the name of a hockey player who's now a coach in the NHL. Who decades ago I thought, oh, it's Nasruddin is the actual person's name, but I misread it and I thought Nassadrine, what a great name. So that became Jacob. Uh, Laney Jackman is no relation to the actor Hugh Jackman, but I'm remembering now that you're asking this question. When I was in film school, I wrote a screenplay in which Bill Jackman was the name of a character, and Bill is the name of Laney's father. And now that we're going down that rabbit hole, there was an editor in a magazine I was in 20 years ago whose name was Alanya, or who went by Laney. So I think I stole the name from her.
So, being, having gone through film school, first of all, I was able to picture the whole thing. It was very
Cool.
cinematic. But have you sold the film rights of the book? And who would you have, if you have thought about it, who would you have act in the lead roles?
Wow. I haven't thought about film rights. I don't have a lot of connections. I don't have any connections in the film world, really. I do have a script for it because I do have that training in the screenplay, but I don't really expect much to happen with it. I think usually it's got to be a super popular book for that to happen. I have not really thought about who I would put in there at all. And it's a screenwriting trick to imagine actors as your characters. When I teach screenwriting, I encourage students to do that. I say, make Hugh Jackman your protagonist and make Scarlett Johansson your protagonist, just so you have a person to kind of write scenes for. You can kind of physically peg that person into that role. But for me, writing the script for this, I knew the characters and I kind of had a vision for how they looked and how they moved. And so I didn't go through that phase.
So what was it like to live with such colorful characters?
Oh, it's kind of like my family. They are my family. They're people. I totally believe in treating my fictional characters like they're people that I know. And if I can imagine, what it would be like to be around them, even after I've finished writing the work, to me, that's a sign that I have invested emotionally in them and done my work and done my job at creating these characters. I remember when it was set in Colorado, I would drive by the place which had been their house, and I would just sort of wave to them and say, "Hi." Here in South Dakota, I don't get up there very often, but every once in a while I drive by the space where they live, even though the hill they live on is imaginary and the house they live in is imaginary, but the place is still there. And I say, "Hi, how you doing?" Because to me, they are part of my life. They are part of my psychic environment. And I love that about writing. These people, they still live. I look at my characters and I wonder, well, what are they up to now? How is it going for them?
How did you know when you were finished?
Ah,
Or
when I
when were you
start moving,
able to let go?
um, when I start moving words around for the sake of moving words around, that's when I know I'm finished.
Mm.
When I could go this way or I could go this way, and it doesn't really matter. Um, it's hard to tell exactly when with this book I knew I was ready uh, to let it go. I'd have to go back in time and figure out that exact moment. But typically, when I'm just messing around with the words, I think, okay, it's time, and now I need something. I need a new bone to chew on. I guess to follow the dog metaphor, once the marrow is all gone, I need another bone, and at some point the marrow was all gone, and it was just time to send this out.
I would love for you to read for us some.
All right, I'd like to read a passage that shows when Lainey essentially first gets to South Dakota. And she comes to Jacob's house. And what had happened was they met at a hot spring in South Dakota, which isn't really a hot spring. And he said, hey, just go to my house. Door's unlocked. Just if you want to get together, just come over. And this is what she does. As Lainey settled into the bedroom, she had no idea of the place's history of hosting wayward souls or how perfectly she fit in with it. Many before her had slept in that spare bedroom and pondered the same burly, irascible issues that faced her, though most were Navy men. The house had been built in 1920 by a World War II bombardier named Olin Darson, whose infirm parents had subdivided their farm in his absence to stay afloat. When his folks died 5 years later, Olin opened up the house to his fellow veterans who'd come home to a different America than they'd left, and hoped that the open skies of South Dakota would help them trade the label of useless vet for another one. Some became plumber, some became drunk, some became firemen, some failed to achieve any identity at all and drifted farther west. One of those who slept in the room bore the name Roland Astron, as well as the labels Sniper and One Screw Loose. He liked the house so much that in 1927 he used his gambling winnings to buy it from Olin Darson, who took the money to Kansas City and disappeared from human history. Astron impregnated a woman named Teresa Flint, who claimed to be a quarter Portuguese, but was actually half Shoshone. And a week after the Wall Street crash of 1929, they welcomed a child named Rhonda into the world. They married a short time later, and the house continued to serve as a way station for the displaced. The family survived Prohibition and the Great Depression thanks to Roland's whiskey still. In 1958, a Korean War U.S. Navy vet from Boston named Edward Hollins Nassadreen decided that he needed to get as far away from the ocean as possible before he became a Navy lifer. He asked around and learned about the Astron House through a fellow sailor's father who'd stayed there 20 years earlier. The continental pole of inaccessibility in North America was actually 5 hours southwest in Allen, South Dakota, but the house outside Clark was close enough for him. When Ed Nassadreen called the number he'd been given, Rhonda Astron, over for her weekly dinner with Mom and Dad, picked up the phone because Teresa was busy taking a ham out of the oven. Rhonda didn't have the heart to turn a vet down, and by the time her mother got to the phone, it was too late to stop Ed from coming. He hitchhiked out, stayed in the tiny spare bedroom on the second floor, and found a job as a welder. 4 months later, he proposed to Rhonda Astron. They got married and tried valiantly, but without success to have children, and eventually her parents died and left them the house. Lainey didn't know any of this history, and Jacob only knew Ed's hitchhiking tale and the legend of Roland Still. When Jacob and Daniel arrived from Boston, freshly orphaned, Ed and Rhonda didn't want them to know the house's long history of giving shelter to the out of luck and the transitory. They wanted to exude stability, a specifically blue-collar stability based on frugality, continuous hard work, and not blowing off so much steam that the fire inside you went out. They never told the boys that the room used to have nicknames: Shambrel Road Lost and Found, Astron Home for the Wayward, Stray Man Depot. They didn't know that dozens, if not hundreds, of people had fallen asleep in that room while their heads spun with uncertainty, doubt, hope, clandestine and sometimes illegal machinations, and the all-pervasive fear of failure. Lainey didn't need to know that such restless emotions were embedded in the DNA of the room in order to feel their force. When the sinking sun hit the window, she unzipped her suitcase and stared at her things. Nothing she owned would help her survive a South Dakota winter. Nothing she was suggested survival either. Too small, too delicate, too bird-like. But she had to make it through because her old self wasn't exactly surviving in LA either. Her old self barely clung to life. Here, she could drag it up from the ground, rebuild it, rehabilitate it. Or could she? Lainey looked out the window and saw only the unfamiliar, only a landscape that was part of other people's psyches. If I can pick myself up here, she reasoned, I can pick up myself anywhere. And if you can't? Her real voice asked. Then the light outside brightened, a physical reality caused by the angle of the sun, not some trick of perception, and Lainey brightened too. She pictured herself years later, long after meeting Jacob in Hot Springs had faded into memory, and knew that this instant would echo in her mind as the moment she truly moved in at Cocklebur Farm. So that's Lainey just kind of getting to South Dakota, getting to the place where hopefully things are going to unfold for her in a positive direction in her life.
This is wonderful,
Thanks.
Stephen. You know, I can hear the poet. I can hear the poet through your sentences. And I can also hear the person who wants his writing to be visual and for people to be engaged in that way too. Full disclosure, I'm reading the book right now. I'm totally rooting for the characters to get together and to be happy together. I'm rooting for them to get help.
Yeah.
and I really want them to actually be legally married. Do you think are they legally married?
Oh, they do. Yeah, they do.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
The first time didn't quite work out because of some paperwork and things, but they get married. Yeah,
okay.
it's a story with a happy ending. It's different from much of the other things I've written. It's a happy ending story. It takes a lot of work to get there, but it does have a happy ending, which
As
I
in
actually
life,
quite
yeah.
enjoy.
Yeah. Well, I so when you were writing this book, did you have someone waiting for it to publish it, or did you have to look for a publisher?
Well, my first novel came out through the University of Nebraska Press Flyover Fiction Series. That was A Fathers in Fire in 2019, another novel that took me a really long time to write. And so they had the right of first refusal. According to the contract for the
Okay.
first book, they were the ones who would take a look at my next book. So they took a look at this one and they liked it and they
Of
wanted
course
to
they
publish
would.
it. I'm really glad to have that home, Katerina. It's hard. I mean, the publishing world is a hard place, and uh, if New York doesn't like you, then you need to find homes elsewhere. And if I could go back and replay things, I probably would have wasted less time trying to please people in the big industry in New York and just probably made a move like this 10, 15 years earlier. My first book in 2008 was Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, so that was kind of a big press. And I just spent all this time trying to write books that would please these people, and it just never worked. So to have Nebraska there, it's a perfect alignment of my geographical interests and theirs, because the Flyover Fiction Series is dedicated to Great Plains fiction. So it's kind of a big swath of North America, up from Winnipeg all the way down to around San Antonio, and from the Iowa border to the middle of Colorado. It's a pretty big swath, and that's my territory, specifically between Colorado and South Dakota, and down maybe even into northern Kansas and up into North Dakota. This is kind of my world, and I know it reasonably well, although I can't pretend to be a South Dakota person. My South Dakota characters are possibly forever going to be people who are from the outside. But the plains is my landscape.
But I would argue that you're, amongst other things, that you're a South Dakota writer at this point in time.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that was part of the realization. I am a South Dakota writer. I got tenure. Have my first book out, and I thought, okay, well, what's next?
Yeah.
What's next? And so I have embraced being a South Dakota writer a lot more now that I have a book coming out that's set there. And I haven't, until this point, I haven't really embraced it because it's a hard place for me to live. I definitely struggle with it in the way that my characters do. I struggle to understand it. I struggle to fit in, and this book in some ways is part of a process of reconciliation for me with the place.
Can you describe the cover for our listeners/viewers?
The cover is it's a cake. It's a partially eaten wedding cake with one last slice on it. I love it. When the South Dakota Book Festival comes around this year, the director there says she wants to do wants to recreate this cake for the event, which I think would be wonderful. Um, yeah, it's a great cover. It's not, what I had envisioned, but I'm just a writer. I'm not an artist. So I think the artists usually do a whole lot better job at figuring out what a cover should look like than a writer does. It's something that, I don't know, really appeals to me. I love it.
Who are your, and you don't have to name names, but okay, so do you have trusted readers, and what is your trusted readers process? I mean, when and how do you let people in into your drafts and your process?
When I think I have it done, there are a few people, and it varies from book to book. I'm not a huge workshop person, but there are a few people who I can trust to tell me when I'm BSing myself. And they can look at a book and say, that doesn't make sense to me. This doesn't make sense to me. And that sends me back to the till. Workshops, I think they're really wonderful, but I am not an addict of workshops. And to me, that just having a couple of friends who can look at your work, I always looking for new people and try to do things for them as well. Just kind of exchange that book when you think you got it done, but you're not really quite sure that it's done. So early on, I wouldn't want to show anybody. I think I've developed over time enough of a self-critical apparatus and enough of a process of writing it and then putting it away and writing it and putting it away. But that last step, it's nice to have other people take a look at your work.
What is the most important thing you teach your students? That's a question I ask everybody who teaches creative writing. So if there is one thing you want your students to remember from your class, what is it?
Love your characters. You've got to love your characters. If you don't love them like they're real people, and this kind of alludes to something I said a little bit back, if you don't love them like you're real people, then you're not going to be able to invest in them, and you're also not going to be able to show them in all their personality. If you have characters, even secondary characters that are just throwaway people to you, how are you going to show that person in the real light of life? And also, if you have a character who you don't you kind of like, but just in an abstract way, you don't have that serious emotional connection to, how are you going to be able to see that character's flaws? How are you going to be able to watch that character move through the paces of their life and move toward whatever it is that you want them to move toward? And it also really helps if you love your characters, if you're a novelist or a short story writer who does a ton of rewriting. And I find that I need to do a ton of rewriting. I'm always getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the characters and the setting. And if you don't love your characters, you're going to tap out earlier than if you do. So it's that love for the characters, that curiosity and fascination that it drives me. And I think that if you let it drive you, you're going to end up with stronger work because you're going to have that emotional connection to your characters. If you don't have that emotional connection to your characters, nobody else out there is going to have that emotional connection either.
Do you teach yourself that skill of loving and being curious? And
I don't know if I need to teach myself that anymore because that's kind of been my driving force for a long time. Uh, but the ways that I find that I love my characters change with age, just kind of like uh, children. You know, they change with age, and the way you express your love for your children changes with age. So does it with the characters as well. Part of it to me is the older I get and the more I write, the easier it is for me to see the resonance and to feel
Mhm.
the resonance between myself and my characters. And sometimes that comes to the surface fairly quickly, which means that I can then move on to other aspects of their characters. So once that connection becomes apparent, I say, "Oh, okay. Well, this is my this is something about my psychic world that has now been put into the petri dish of my character's psychic world. Now let's keep on looking at that character and find out what else there is to love about them and how else I can love them and understand them." Because once that obvious connection has risen to my conscious level, it's time to go back down and look for more.
I have to ask you about your book of prose poems.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you about 31 octets, incantations and meditations. So it was published in 2014. And, I interview so many poets that I cannot pass on the opportunity to hear about it.
It's another labor of love. That's this book right here, and I believe this is CW Books. I believe are they out of Lexington, Kentucky, or are they out of Ohio? Um,
I don't think they're from
no,
Lexington, but
they're Cincinnati.
okay.
Um, 31 Octets is one of these projects that happened to me uh, while I was in the downtime from writing a novel. I don't know which one it was. Uh, but I had to get away from story. I had to get away from character. And when I do that, what I really like to do is to get into the most elemental relationship with language as possibly can. Get away from, you know, motivations and all those kinds of things and just deal with language as closely to the bone as I can. I think of writers like Gertrude Stein, Antonin Artaud, William S. Burroughs. This is kind of my Mount Rushmore of experimental writers. Except it's missing one. There's the last one always changes, but those three are pretty consistent. And what I love about them is that they just dwell in the most elemental relationship with language possible. They unlock the word horde and the words come. So for me, what had happened at the beginning of the genesis of 31 Octets, I was listening to a recording of T.S. Eliot doing 4 quartets, and I thought to myself, well, if T.S. Eliot can do 4 quartets, I can do 80 octets. And so I said, aha, there's my idea. This is what I do. And I got a nice notebook and used my favorite pen and took off my glasses and sat in my chair every morning and just wrote what came to mind. And the octet as far as I know, is an invented form, and it's essentially an anaphora. So there are 8 stanzas of prose poem, all of which start with the same phrase. So I wrote well over 80 of those, thinking I would cut them down to 80, and then maybe, okay, maybe they're not all great, so let me pick the 31 best. And that ended up being 31 octets. So this is something that I do just as a reset. When I get too into fiction, I start thinking too much about plot, I start thinking too much about career, and I need to get away and do something that is much more elemental. I don't think of myself as a poet. Uh, I, I think that the poets that I know, they know their dactyls from their spondees, and I still need to look it up. I need to look up some of these forms, and I don't absorb that in the same way. So I've not really been writing a lot of line poetry lately. Although that honestly, when I first started writing, that's one of the first things I did. What I mostly do now is prose poems. Uh, should I read? Should I read one?
Yes, please.
All right. Now these, I have to make sure that I have a good, clean one. Let's try this one. This is called Octet Designed to Calm Us Both Down, which maybe America needs right now. Breath in, breath out. It's that elemental. And with each breath come words cascading, words twirling around one another, while their intentions become even more muddled than human will can make them. Breath in, breath out. Notice that I'm not saying breathe here. I'm thinking of breath not as a willed activity, but as something that happens to you, that comes in and goes out of its own accord, something that has a mind of its own and an agenda for you that you cannot possibly understand. Breath in, breath out, and you don't need esoteric religions to do it right. Breath in, breath out, because it's what snakes do, and squirrels, and marmots, and aardvarks, and hyenas, and wolverines. Breath invites itself inside them, suffuses them with Atman, aka Prana, aka the Holy Spirit, then smiles and floats away to seek another recipient. Breath in, breath out. And don't think about breath's agenda because you aren't meant to understand it. You are meant to live it, nothing more. Breath in, breath out. Though sometimes hints of that agenda will come to you because the agenda is imprinted whole upon each breath, and you can occasionally digest portions of it with your imagination. The true sage, however, knows to only live the agenda and not interview it to death, not gouge its skin for the wisdom sealed beneath. Breath in, breath out. Though you shouldn't assume from the previous stanza that I think I'm a true sage myself. I interview breath's agenda like the CIA. I stick a microphone in its face with one hand and take paparazzi candids with the other. I am among the worst offenders. Breath in, breath out. If you truly understand this now, you may put my book down, for you have now stolen all its treasures. But I might be lying to you. There might be more treasures hidden beneath this pile of words. So read on, or risk watching what you seek slip away. So these are tremendous fun for me to write. So when I get off of fiction and go into prose poetry, it's a blast. It's hard to find homes for these things, but they are tremendous fun to write.
Such abundance of writing, such abundance of creativity, projects. You know, I admire you so much, Stephen, for everything that
Thank
you
you.
have been able to accomplish in writing poems, in writing short stories, in writing novels, in teaching, in living in another place that you're embracing in your own and integrating it into yourself. And what are you working on now? Do you have any projects or ambitions? What's next?
I do have a couple of projects. One is a short story collection that's set in the Great Plains, and I am working my way through that right now, and hoping to get more time to write a few new ones. And there are a few older ones that I need to revise. Uh, and it's funny, my first short story collection, Wife Shopping, these were stories written in the late 90s, most of them. And it wasn't until about 2005 or so that I realized that it was a collection and that it had a title. This one, I had the totally opposite experience. Mercy and Debris was my title, and I had that title page in a notebook before I had any short stories written for it. So it's been a weird and very different type of process. The things that I have going with prose poems right now are I've got one collection that I feel pretty good about. I want to publish some more before I send it out to see if it can become a book. Uh, it's essentially prose poems in response to a book called I and Thou by Martin Buber, which I had read when I was about 17. And Martin Buber was a Jewish theologian, and I and Thou is it's just a great little book. It's really, really dense. But I read it when I was a college student, and I didn't really understand it, but it made this immense impression on me, and has influenced everything that I've read theologically since then. And so this collection of poems is in response to I and Thou. And there's another thing. I kind of did the same thing with another book that I read when I was in college. First couple of years of school. A crazy book called "The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind" by a Princeton philosophy professor named Julian Jaynes.
So it's a little light reading, sounds like, huh?
Very light reading, yeah. What he talks about is kind of how consciousness developed over time, and in the ancient world. And it's an amazing book that, again, it made this huge impression on me as a late teenager, and I just didn't have the reading experience to understand it. So I went back to read it again, and then I went back and I picked phrases out, and those phrases became the titles of a new batch of prose poems. And this is, wow, I haven't looked at that probably in a year, because it's in its rising time. It's like dough. It's got to rise and be punched down. So I have a bunch of those that I can't even remember what they look like. I can't even remember what they sound like.
Perfect.
Fun. It's so much fun that way.
Yeah, perfect. Now you'll be able to go back to it. Let's see, from 80 we can make 31.
Exactly. Katrina, that's so true. I mean, that's the joy of the creative process, is going back into something that you've created and saying, all right, what do we have here? How can I turn this into something that is more of itself? And really just kind of go all the way with the work.
And it could be the other way around. Well, here are 30 and they need to be 80, and let me start writing some more. And one thing that I heard over and over from you this interview is every book is different. Every book has different process. And here's, right. I had the title long ago, and then I wrote the book. And it took me like about a decade to figure out that's a collection of short stories. And good luck with everything, Stephen, and come back, whenever you have new books, come back, we'll talk again, and we'll follow up with whatever happens to you.
Thanks.
Best of luck with The Leaf Takers. Show us again that beautiful book.
Show us again. Available now for pre-order at University of Nebraska Press. The Leaf Takers.
Yeah.
I love
so
I love the
much.
book. I love the characters, and I really appreciate being on this show. It's a wonderful thing, and something I definitely want to, definitely want to stay in touch and keep on doing this whenever there's a new book.